If Europe's reached the point of no return, where did it go wrong? Where are we now?
Europe is a project that still needs to be constructed into a peaceful future.
Get rid of borders, live together, understand each other.
It's not a paradise. There are a lot of problems, the refugee problem, for example.
Because I'm young, I'd say that the biggest advantage for me is freedom of movement.
Unity and love between countries. Because we're all together as one nation. It's beautiful, it's great.
Well, we are seeing the growth of nationalism, with far-right parties gaining ground. That's what scares me. Division and discontent, that's nothing new for Europe. The difference is EU leaders think they might just have a plan to change that. And it's going to be thrashed out in just a few days' time. Unity seems to be the byword of the moment. Rather ironically, EU leaders will be broaching the bloc's unprecedented division at a celebration marking the 60th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome that famously called for an ever closer union. Well aware of Europe's multiple crises, the European Commission has come up with a 5-option proposal on Europe's future. It presents various levels of EU integration, from an EU stripped down to its bare economic essentials via a 2-speed or multi-speed Europe to a fully integrated European machine. And whether you like it or not, Eurocrats will play a key role in determining Europe's future. So we're here at the European Parliament to speak to lawmakers to see how in touch they are with Europe's changing future. We start with two men who've shaped and are shaping Europe's future on opposite sides of the political divide. Nigel Farage, an almost celebrity Eurosceptic who successfully campaigned to get Britain out of the European Union. But first, Guy Verhofstadt, a staunch defender of the European project and also the European Parliament's Brexit negotiator. Now, you're seen as one of the flag bearers of federalism, but do you think that your dream of a kind of integrated Europe is dead and it's going to be buried in Rome during the treaty celebrations?
I think it's an absolute necessity that we go in that direction, otherwise this continent will not survive. So I think it's a good opportunity to remember not only the Treaty of Rome, but mainly the initial ideas of the founding fathers of the European Union. A political union, an economic union, a defense union, and that's exactly what we need for the coming decades, I think.
And so Jean-Claude Juncker, the head of the European Commission, has put forward 5 proposals.
Exactly.
Now, it seems that the multi-speed proposal is gaining the most traction.
The multi-speed exists already today, let's be honest.
So it wouldn't work?
Well, it won't work. It will in any way be a core group who will take the lead. More or less 20, maybe more, 25 countries going forward, and then a number of other countries who will come in later on. That I see as a possibility.
Would you propose kicking out countries that don't adhere to your vision?
What I see is the opposite for the moment. After the Brexit referendum, in most of the countries, we see that people want more Europe.
So in terms of defence, if we look to this future Europe, how would that work? Do you encourage the idea of a European army?
Yeah. Look, for example, what's happening in Syria. What we did in Syria, nothing at all. But we have the fallout, all the negative consequences of the conflict in Syria. So I think it's time now to organize ourselves.
Could you tell me 3 issues that you agree with when it comes to Eurosceptic politicians?
When they say, for example, that we are not capable to manage the refugee crisis, I agree. When they are saying that we have no good results in tackling the financial crisis, I agree. When they are saying that the European Union is too bureaucratic, I agree. But the response to the solution for that is not to go back in history and falling back into the old-style nation-states that have created so much trouble and so much tragedies in the 20th century.
And finally, if I were to ask you to look at European integration on a scale of 0 to 5, 0 being zero integration, 5 being maximum, your United States of Europe that you used to talk about, where would you place your future Europe?
Put me in the middle, that's not a...
Thank you very much. Nigel Farage, has Europe reached the point of no return?
I thought so some time ago. I think if you look at the multiple crises that it faces, I mean, firstly, Brexit, which is the worst thing that's ever happened to the European Union. Secondly, relations with Turkey breaking down completely, meaning that with the summer coming, the migrant crisis is back on the agenda, let alone Greek repayments coming up in July and some big questions over some of the major Italian banks. And that backdrop against the big presidential campaign in France, I think what's clear is this, that the direction of travel is back towards nation state. Now, that doesn't mean people don't want a European cooperation. They do, very much so, but not this kind of centralised government.
And so the issue of a defence union is firmly back on the table. Now, that's something you've warded against. You're worried about a European army.
Yes.
Now, with Britain out of the European Union, do you think that's a foregone conclusion?
I think what's interesting is to see the way the Trump victory has been used by Mr. Verhofstadt, by Mr. Juncker. They're saying, the Americans are leaving Europe, therefore we have to have our own European army, or they want nuclear weapons now as well. Actually, Mr. Trump doesn't want to withdraw from Europe at all. He just wants NATO members to pay their fair share. I would view the full development of a European army with its own foreign policy and its own nuclear weapons actually as being something potentially quite dangerous.
Why?
Because we already know that the European Union wishes to expand. And eastwards expansion by nations, history tells us, leads to conflict. We're on a collision course with Putin's Russia. And I think if these people in these institutions have more power, they are likely to use it.
And so, Brexit is now firmly on the cards. Do you see a massively reducing European Union?
I think that the attitude of the European Union right now is they firmly believe that Brexit is it, that no other countries are going to leave. And I think they're wrong. I think they're wrong. I think they will go on defending their model. And I'm not saying that Frexit's going to happen this year, but is it going to happen in the next 3 or 4 years? I firmly believe that it will.
And then finally, if we look at European integration on a scale of 0 to 5, where would you place yourself?
In terms of integration, 0. In terms of cooperation, 5.
Like Brexit, it's the younger Europeans who'll face the full force of any decision taken. Ska Keller is from the Greens EFA group. She's young, dynamic and ambitious. Her stated aim to change the world. Well, let's start with Europe. Ska Keller, many thanks for being with us. What future do you see for Europe if we see young Europeans rallying more and more behind Eurosceptic and populist politicians and their movements?
Actually, I also see the opposite. I would say that people are now realizing, especially young people, that what they take for granted, the European integration, the European togetherness, it's not for granted, and that they really need to start moving in order to keep it. But that's happening now.
I know that migration is a cause close to your heart. Do you think it's possible to deal with the migration crisis humanely in a multi-speed Europe?
I'm not a big fan as such of multi-speed because it risks leaving some countries or even regions alone and behind. We should always aim for the whole union to move forward. But there is things that several member states together can do, and especially in the asylum. When I'm thinking about resettlement, for example, some member states could say, okay, others don't want to come along, but we do something, we resettle more refugees.
So let's look now quickly at the issue of trade. You were against the Canada-EU trade pact, but do you see that now as the future of EU trade?
I don't see CETA as my ideal for future trade agreements. In CETA, there's a lot of problematic points. There we have a privileged court system for investors alone. So investors can go there and sue member states, whereas me as an individual, if my rights are infringed by a company, I cannot do anything really. I would like to see as a trade that is happening, but that it's fair and that it's not harming the planet and is improving the rights and standards that we have and not endangering those standards.
Well, you mentioned the planet, and obviously climate change is a very big cause now, but do you fear, with all the crises that Europe is facing, changing face of politics globally, that climate is just going to drop down the agenda?
We're the first generation to already see the impacts of climate change, but we're also the last generation that can do something about it. And if we get this wrong, then we have a huge disaster in the future. So let's do something about it now while we still can do it.
And finally, if I were to ask you to look at European integration on a scale of 0 to 5, where would you place your ideal future Europe?
I would then probably put myself in a 4, but with a lot of disclaimers.
Fantastic. Thank you.
You will put a lot of disclaimers there?
Viviane Reding next. She's a fixture of European politics, a conservative from the powerful EPP bloc that represents more traditional European values. Viviane Reding, there are 5 proposals on the table, different proposals to tackle the many crises Europe is facing.
It's first not in order to tackle a crisis. We have been, during the 60 last years, been building bridges and tearing down the walls. I think it is a real example in mankind, and so we have to continue from this. Now, there are different scenarios on the table. My continuation scenario is very clear. I would like to arrive in the end, that means for the next generation, at a real federal Europe.
Okay, so how would that actually tackle then the very massive crisis Europe is facing, and in particular the economic crisis, because you're not necessarily going to get everybody on board?
Europe is the strongest economy in the world, so we are facing a crisis temporarily, as others also are facing crisis, and this is a temporary question of how you do that. So these are the short-term questions we have to solve.
Do you think the future of the euro, as you look ahead, is secure?
Absolutely, and I do not see any crisis in the euro. The euro is the second biggest exchange currency and reserve currency in the world. Let the countries who would like to leave, leave. I am of those who say, I do not keep anybody inside. What is in crisis, actually, is the national policy of some of the countries who simply are doing a lousy work.
Justice and fundamental rights are issues very close to your heart, but those kind of rights are being battered in many parts of Europe.
We poured in billions of euros in order to bring these countries up. Solidarity cannot always be a one-way street.
Which countries are you thinking about?
Well, I can quote, for instance, Poland. I can quote also President Orban, because I do not believe that his population thinks the same. So these countries are opening their hand in order to get something, but incapable of giving something back. So we have to change that.
And finally, if we look to your Europe of the future and we look at levels of integration, 0 being no European integration at all, 5 being maximum, where would you place your future Europe?
I put the future Europe at 4.5 because nobody can be perfect, but that is what we want to achieve.
Since Brexit, since Trump, nationalist politicians are dreaming big. The French National Front has its sights firmly set on the country's upcoming presidential elections. We met up with their MEP, Nicolas Bay. Immigration is obviously a major issue for you and one that's causing a lot of problems for the EU. How do you see things progressing?
We're facing massive immigration, and this massive immigration is welcomed by the technocrats in Brussels in the name of that famous dogma of free movement. Schengen is a total failure, and it's vital to reinstate control of our borders. There have been controls for centuries, and there is no reason why they shouldn't be re-established.
Well, how would you control immigration? Would it be a clean break?
The movement should be reversed. Measures must be taken to return illegal immigrants to their countries of origin, and also certain legal immigrants who don't necessarily have jobs until their residency permits expire.
The National Front is advocating an exit from the Eurozone, in spite of the fact that the majority of French people stand against abandoning a common European currency.
It's clear today that the euro is serving the interests of Germany to the detriment of most of the other countries in the Eurozone. We must retrieve a national currency and keep a common currency for international exchange, which would be made of national currencies so that each country can adapt to the state of their economy.
While we can see an increase in the far right in the EU, can you imagine an almost mini far right European Union where you'd have really strong partnerships?
I don't think there is a far right. There are just patriots. Here in the Parliament in Strasbourg, we have a group made up of dozens of nationalities. We are in no way extremists. What we want is a renegotiation of the European treaties. And if this isn't possible, and if, like David Cameron, we come up against a brick wall before Mr. Juncker, at that time the French people should be offered a referendum for Brexit, so that Europe can be rebuilt differently afterwards.
If I were to ask you to look at European integration on a scale of 0 to 5, where would you place yourself?
Zero integration, but a real policy for cooperation.
Populist politicians are considered masters of communication, an area the EU doesn't always seem to really excel at. Well, these are issues we discuss, amongst others, with Tanja Fajon, a former journalist and rising star of the European Parliament. There are going to be some crucial meetings coming up on the future of Europe. The European Commission President has got some proposals on the table. Do they provide a valid blueprint for the future?
I have to say that I was disappointed when the Commission came out with a white paper. I expected some clear direction, not 5 different scenarios that actually are causing a lot of turbulences now, if I speak in my society, because people start wondering, are we now the second, third class of union?
So you feel, as a small country, Slovenia, if the multi-speed option is the one that's taken up, you'll just be forgotten about. Your voice is just not going to be heard.
What I would like to say, coming from a small country, this is extremely dangerous. We might then be felt really much behind, walking behind the others.
And so the Treaty of Rome celebrations are just around the corner. What kind of image do you think the leaders there are going to portray? If you imagine that family photo at the end.
I imagine there will be quite some sparkling events and beautiful family photos. I hope also with some very strong messages to the citizens.
And Europe, and the EU in particular, really does have an image problem now. The institutions are often seen as out of touch. Is that a representative picture of Europe?
Certainly citizens are feeling much too far from what Brussels or political elite is doing, and I think this is the time when we have to bring this project back to the citizens. I think there are still a lot of positive stories. We have to see Europe today or 50, 60 years ago. There has been quite tremendous progress also, and we have to speak also media about positive stories.
Finally, I want you to imagine European integration on a scale of 0 to 5. Where would you place your future ideal Europe?
I would say 4 maybe, to have a lot of cooperation there where it's needed.
Despite all the ideas and proposals on the table, the EU's future remains quite vague, to say the least. And for EU leaders gathering for the Treaty of Rome celebrations, they'll no doubt be aware that change is really no longer a matter of choice. For the EU project, it's become a matter of survival.